Do you want to paint a beautiful primrose? Today I'll show you two ways, one simple and beginner friendly and one using a reference photo for a more realistic result. If you've ever felt intimidated by using a reference photo, have no fear. I used to feel the same way. But once I learned how to use it, it completely transformed my art. I'll guide you step by step through each of these flowers, first through the simple beginner friendly version, and then I'll show you how to take your flowers further with layering and a reference photo for a more realistic result. No matter where you are in your art journey, you'll find an approach that works for you. I've included timestamps in this video so you can go right to the flower of your choice. Let's go ahead and get started. Now for paper, I'm using Canson XL, which is a nice, inexpensive watercolor paper that we're going to use for this first project. And I'm also using my Simply Simons brushes. And then for my watercolor pencils, I'm going to be working with my Faber-Castell. So I have magenta, Delft blue, earth green yellowish, pine green, light cadmium yellow, dark cadmium yellow, and terracotta. But you can most definitely use whatever watercolor pencil brand you have on hand. Okay, let's start out really simple and just kind of talk about how to draw a primrose really quick here. So this is going to be just our basic, most beginner-friendly primrose flower here, and I'm just going to do a single one. So what I'm going to do is draw a little dot in the center where I want the center of the flower to be, and we will make the center a little more substantial here. And then I'm going to go ahead and do like 5 little lines coming out from the center, something like that. You have a little bit of freedom with how you do those 5. That's where we're going to be drawing our petals. So next step is we're going to draw in these tiny little centers, right like this. But it almost looks like you're drawing a tiny little leaf, more than a petal, right? Almost like a tiny little leaf shape on each of those lines. All right, then what we're gonna do is take each of these same lines and we're gonna draw a larger petal. And this one is actually like a heart shape. So each petal is kind of like a heart. So I'm gonna go ahead and just draw this first one here. And it's an upside down heart, but it's going to be kind of more or less centered on that same line. So the line's going to go through the center of the heart. I'm going to do that one a little bit lopsided. You can do this where each of these petals is, you know, like a little bit more symmetrical or perfect. The one thing you want to do is not do one after the other. You want to space them out a little bit because the way they overlap is a little bit random, but if you go from this to this to this, they'll all kind of end up overlapping a little bit funny. So you're going to want to just do something like that. And then these two, as you can see, will be in the back. And they don't have to be perfect hearts, right? You're basically just kind of almost imagining the hearts are all kind of radiating out from the center here. Something like that. I might even make this one here just a little bit bigger so I have a little bit less of a space. Yeah, something just like that. Okay, let's just quickly draw in some leaves. And the leaves with these are a little bit more, I guess you could say less pointy. They're more rounded. So I'll draw another one here and then maybe one right here. And then in the center, I'm just going to go ahead and draw this little circle shape. Then what I'm going to do is grab my watercolor pencils and just start tracing this entire primrose. So the first color I'm going to grab is my yellow. This is dark cadmium yellow from Faber-Castell. Then I'll grab my light green. And this is earth green yellowish from Faber-Castell. And then this purple color. It's actually called magenta, but it kind of looks purpley, doesn't it? And I'm going to outline the little petals with that. And then I can go ahead and erase all the graphite. And because the watercolor pencil is a little bit more permanent, I'll be able to maintain my lines and I won't have as much of that grayish graphite look. All right, let's go ahead and do this little one first. And I'm going to just go and fill in the yellow. And then you can use a combination of either green or terracotta to kind of do the center of this. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of make a little bit like almost like a crescent moon shape here. And that's going to give the impression of the center of the flower. I'm not going to be super detailed. You can often see like the stigma in the middle. I'm just going to keep this one simple and just do it like that. And then grab my terracotta and do these tiny little lines just to give it a little bit of depth. I might even throw a little bit of the brighter yellow on top because I was using a little bit of an orangey yellow. So just brighten things up a little bit with this one here. This one is light, yeah, light cadmium yellow. So it's just a little more intense, a little cooler too. But anyways, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. And then I'm just gonna go really simply and use regular coloring and fill in these little petals. The thing I'm gonna do with this is I'm gonna leave a little white gap between the purple and the yellow. Just a tiny gap, not much. Otherwise, I'm just gonna kind of use a basic kind of flat circular coloring and just fill this in. So I'll just speed things up a little for a minute here. Then I'm trying to decide what direction to take for my shadow colors. I want to go with a darker purple. I've got Delft blue here as well as red violet. And I actually kind of like this top one better. I don't know, or I shouldn't say necessarily like it better. I just feel like it's more different from what I've been doing. So I'm going to go ahead with this color, but you can definitely kind of go more with a little bit of a warmer purple instead of such a cool purple. This is taking a little bit of a jump here, but I think I'm going to like it. So I'm going to go with the Delft blue, which is kind of a purpley blue. So let's see what we think. And basically where I'm putting that is just kind of right behind. So where there's an overlap, I'm going to put a little bit of that in there. So a little bit of overlap here. Basically anytime it's kind of behind another petal, so you can see that's starting to push the petals apart. You could even do this just with like heavier pressure of the color we already used, but I'm going to do that as step one to just kind of push those apart a little bit. And then I'm going to just put a tiny little bit along the very edges of the petals here. So just so that we have a little bit of variety in this. There's no reason you can't just make it solid. This is just going to help give it some depth. So like I say, just go around the outside of the heart a little bit and go like so. And then we're going to wet things. The other thing you could actually do is take this color and do a few almost like lines coming towards the center, or like even, you know, where that center line was that we had before that we erased. There's no reason you couldn't do that center line just with this color. Just gives it a little bit of dimension, like the little bits of either creases and folds within these little petals, or to give the impression that it's maybe a little bit of variation. Sometimes flowers aren't totally flat, right, in their pigmentation. So I'm going to do that, and we could go ahead and wet this and then come back and do the little leaves. Let's just go ahead and do the leaves. So same simple concept, coloring them in. Some of this is just like coloring with a coloring book. So I'm going to just do this quick. Then once I've got my light green on there, I'm going to go ahead and just draw in some details here with my darker green. So once again, the centers, and then the veins coming this way tend to be a little bit more, I don't know, almost running like a little bit more to the sides than usual. Often when I do a leaf, I've got them kind of running like this, but it feels like when I'm, or I should say not feels, when I'm looking at photos, I feel like, I keep saying feel, but you know what I'm saying? These veins kind of come more to the side on these particular flowers. Maybe I'll put a little bit of shadow right under the petals here as well, just to add a little dimension, maybe a little bit along the side of here. We can always drop a little bit of purple in, as you know I like to do. I like to throw a little bit of color into my leaves at the very end, or I should say after I've wet them. So we have that option as well. I'm just going to put a little bit to kind of create a bit of definition here. Get these a little darker. I feel like I'm a bit dark, or sorry, a bit washed out. And once again, do a few like that. You know what? That seems still almost dull to me. I could grab my indigo blue or even the Delft blue that we were using and just kind of push these a little further. So I've just grabbed the Delft blue again. Again, this is kind of a little bit on the purpley side, but I'm going to try this and just accentuate the veins with this color. Okay. That will definitely dull our greens down, but let's go ahead and wet this one. So if you've watched any of my videos, you definitely know you're going to want your paper towel handy because we're going to be working, we do work fairly dry in watercolor pencils compared to watercolor. So I dab my brush off, like I wet it and then I dab it off so we're not too wet, especially this is going to be essential as we come to the center of the flower. So what I'm going to do is start where it's the yellowest, brightest yellow, and I'm going to very gently come around. So I'm really kind of just working along the outside of each of these little shapes right now, just kind of wetting and moistening the outside. Then I'm going to come in to where I've got that kind of slightly orangey terracotta color. So I'm working my way from light to dark. And then finally, I'm going to try, you know what? I'm wondering if I want to do that green after. Let's just very damp, use a very damp brush and just almost like dab it. You have to be so careful. I might be wiser to wait and do that green as a second layer, but it did work. You just have to be so careful that doesn't bleed around. And we might, because everything's wet now and it's going to kind of, the pigments are going to keep wiggling around a little bit amongst each other, it might go a little bit funny and we might have to define it more once it's dried. But right now, I'm just going to let it be. And you can see very, very faintly, I've got that little bit of almost like white between. And because I left that little bit of white, I did see some photos where that little bit of white was there with some primrose flowers. And so I'm going to take advantage of that and use that so I don't have to wet everything right up to the yellow, if that makes sense. If you want your purples to come exactly touching your yellows, you're going to want to let the yellow dry all the way, use a hair dryer, whatever you have to do to let this center completely dry, then come and do your purples. But for the sake of time, I'm going to leave that little bit of white there and see what I think about it. And if you don't like the white there and you followed me in this step right now, you can always close it, kind of close it in once this is dry. So you're not stuck if you do this. You can close that up. You just have to wait for everything to dry, then color again, and then moisten again, if that makes sense. So you can see I started in my lightest purple, right like that, right? So let's go over here and do this one. So kind of start being very careful that I don't touch my yellows, because if the yellow and purple touch, it's okay if they slightly mingle, but yellow and purple are across from the color wheel. They're across the color wheel from each other, and they will make mud if they mush together a little too much. So that's why I'm being more careful with this. I'm going to show you the color wheel in a little bit here, just to kind of explain that better, if you're not familiar with the color wheel. Super helpful to understand color theory when you're going to work in watercolor pencils. Well, any medium, any medium, you need to understand color theory. It's exciting to understand color theory. Okay, so you could see once again what I did there. I just got moist in that light area first and then dragged into the darks. Now, if I want these to stay separate, I'm going to want to do them as a second layer. Otherwise, they might just mingle too much together. So I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to go ahead and do this leaf here. And because I'm doing it at the same time that this is wet, the colors will mingle a little bit. And yes, they might even look a little bit muddy if I'm not careful. But if I'm just, you can see, it just kind of, the green just kind of went poof into the purple there. And I don't mind how that looks. If you don't like that, make sure your flower is 100% dry before you do this. I don't mind that slight bit of mingling. I think that's kind of pretty. So let's let this dry for a minute, and then I'll come back and do those other parts. All right, so I've let this dry. It's not 100% dry, but I think it's dry enough I can kind of move along here. But just be aware, I may end up with a tiny little bit of bleeding, and in that case, you just want to let it be 100% dry. But I'm going to come in here and just, again, come where the light areas are and work into the darks. Just let that kind of bleed around. And it seems like it's doing okay. The colors or the petals aren't mushing together, so that's a good thing. Okay, come into the light areas again and up into the darks. And you can see that's just moving around nicely, and it's more or less staying on the petal that's supposed to stay in. As you know, if there's too much, like if this was soaking wet here, all that would just go poof right into here, and then those petals would no longer be separate. But if you do find that you don't like how light things have dried, you can always come in, and you would want this 100% dry. This is kind of just, it's really close, but it's got like almost a very, very, very slight, hard to describe. I want to say tacky, but it's not the right word. It just, when you go to put your pencil on, if it's not 100% dry, you'll feel, it just feels different. It doesn't color the same. The color doesn't, if it's super wet, the color will come off too much. And if it's the stage it's at now, it's going to just lay down in a weird way, almost tacky. It's like I say, you almost should just try it and then you'll know. This is how it feels when it's too wet, when it's still partly wet, and you'll know what it feels like when it's fully dry. Anyway, so I'm just going ahead and working light to dark, just like I did earlier. So getting the lighter green wet first and then just gently blending into the dark greens. I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry. I think I wanna maybe add another layer on here just to give it a little bit more dimension, but we don't wanna do that while it's wet. So I'll go ahead and dry it quick and then I'll be back. All right, so now that this is dry, I'm gonna go ahead and just start with our center, and I'm gonna just put a little bit more of that green here because as you could tell, things kind of got a little washed out when I blended them. So I'm just gonna deepen those by putting a little bit more of my green on here. And then maybe even a tiny bit of the darker green too. Then I'm gonna grab my lighter purple or the magenta color and just come in and put a little bit more of that along the edges of the petals where one petal is behind another. And that's just gonna help to create the effect of those back petals looking like they are indeed further behind the front petals. Then I'm gonna go ahead and add some of my bluish color as well. That's the Delft blue. And just accentuate those a little bit further. And then I'm also going to put a little extra shadow kind of on the lower left portion of the primrose flower as a whole, and that's going to give the impression that that is the side that's furthest away from the light. And then to blend, if you want to do anything else with the center of the primrose, you can. You have to be really, really careful. Work very dry in this case. If you have too much water on your brush, everything will like overblend and you will not be happy with it, especially because we have a few colors going, right? We have some green and that terracotta color. I already feel like things are a little mushier than I want them to be. So it's an option. You can just leave that dry. I maybe should have left it dry just because I feel like I'm losing some of that detail that I finally added back in. But okay, I can always come back in with a dry pencil and add that and then don't blend it. But because I haven't come up to the very edges of the yellow, I can come a little closer now with my purple colors. So let's just quickly fill in the purple colors once again. So just blending. Again, I'm working where it's light here and then dragging into my darks just to blend that around. Then I will just bring it just ever so carefully a little closer to the yellow if you want to fill that gap in. Again, if you were okay with the gap the way it was, you can definitely leave it. Some of those primrose flowers do have a little bit of a gap there of white, but you might not like that look. And so if that's the case, you can just come right up to the yellow with your purple and then drag into your darks. And I'm working drier so that I don't get things over blending. If I work too wet, I'll just lose everything that I've done here. It is kind of, I might skip this one, come back to it at the end. Let's work on this one here. I might even okay, you can see I haven't come quite up to the edge with my water, or I should say quite up to the yellows with the water yet. That's okay. I just need to wash and dry my brush if I want to pull that in a little bit closer to the yellow. Then, I think this is dry enough. It might be dry enough I can do this. I'll just have to be very careful. Just try and be more on the dry side with my brush so that I don't drown these little petals and lose my definition. Let's see if I can just drag a little bit of it up here. I probably don't have quite enough on my brush. Let's just do this. Just take a tiny little bit right off the pencil and just pull that up towards the yellow. Again, that's optional, but I imagine some of you would prefer to not have that little white section. So now this petal is touching the other petals, so it could bleed around if I'm not careful. I'm gonna have to be very careful as I go ahead and blend it. Make sure I'm not too wet and that I don't have things bleed. If it is starting to bleed, you can always just stop and let it dry and then come back. I think it's okay, so I'm just gonna let it be like that. I don't know, might try and smooth this off right here a little tiny bit. Okay, let's just leave that be. I made sure this is fully dry and I'm just coming in and adding those details back in since I feel like I washed them out a little too much earlier. Again, this is optional and I'm going to just leave it dry this time. Even though it's not going to have the watercolor look, I feel like I don't have a lot of watercolor look anyways on this particular flower. And so I think we're just going to let it stay dry and gain just a tiny bit more definition here. So that was my yellow, and now I'm just putting a tiny little bit of green on here as well. And that's our simple primrose. Now for this project, I'm actually going to be mostly working with my Staedtler watercolor pencil today. I just happen to really like the color of pink that I have in that set. And so I'm using this pink and then this mauve, violet, sometimes I call it purple. And then this red violet is from Faber-Castell. And then I'm back to the Staedtler colors, the yellow, this light green, a deeper green, and then finally the dark indigo is also by Faber-Castell. And I'm going to carry on using my Simply Simons brushes for this project, but for paper I'm using Arches 140-pound cold press. That's going to allow us to do the layers that we want to do in this project. So I'm starting out with kind of drawing myself a basic outline of where I want my primrose flower to be. I'm not copying this photo exactly, I'm kind of cropping it in my mind, and so I'm just kind of sketching that outline, and then I'm going straight to the center of the flower, and I'm looking at the reference photo to kind of figure out how that center of the flower looks. And so I'm kind of looking back and forth from the reference photo to my paper and just trying to approximately get that center shape. And this one has more detail than what our little fast primrose had, right? But just keep in mind that there's no reason you have to be able to have great drawing skills in order to work from a photo. When I attended my first watercolor pencil class, the teacher actually had us just trace the photo. So we had black and white printed images, and I teach you how to do that on one of my videos. I'll include a link to that. So if you've never traced an image, you can do that just following the directions I provide. But I discovered that tracing when you are starting out is a really, really good way to be able to just learn the medium that you're focusing on. So if it's watercolor pencils, rather than taking the time to learn to draw, which is an absolutely wonderful skill, don't get me wrong, I do teach drawing lessons as well. But when I'm actually focusing on watercolor pencils, and when I teach a watercolor pencil class, I would be just having the students trace the photos so that they don't have to spend class time drawing, and you can actually just focus on learning the ins and outs of the watercolor pencil medium. So I'm going to go ahead and just speed the video up while I do the drawing, because you can either just do the drawing from the reference photo yourself if you feel comfortable with drawing, or as I said, trace, so that we can just move on to the watercolor pencil techniques for today. Now, whether you've done the drawing yourself or you've traced, you're probably going to want to lighten those lines because, as you know, graphite becomes permanent once we add water. So I want to get my drawing a lot lighter than it is. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab my watercolor pencil and just trace everything, because the watercolor pencil is actually going to be a little bit more permanent than the graphite pencil will be. So I can go ahead and trace it all first with this pink, and that way I can go ahead and further erase these graphite lines. And like I say, this is something you'll want to do whether you've drawn or traced, because when you trace, you end up with graphite lines as well. So what we're going to be doing is just going ahead and grabbing our yellow watercolor pencil and just coloring that center in. Pretty simple basic coloring here, and just getting that center filled in with our nice intense yellow. We're going to be adding some more layers after, but for now we're just going to start with our yellow. Maybe I'll throw a little bit of yellow just kind of on the outside of this area too, so that I can have that yellow kind of flow around once I've got the water going here. And as I said, we are going to be working in layers, and so this very first layer is really just going to be a nice kind of wash of yellow. And so I'm going to start out with wetting my brush and just wetting each of these sections really in the white areas first, and then I'm kind of dragging that water into the yellow pigment. And you're going to see I'm going to get a nice soft yellow wash, just kind of almost radiating from the center of my flower into the petals. And so I'm mostly leaving it clear and white, and then just getting a very, very, very soft yellow underpainting here. So just like I say, filling in the water first, dragging it a little bit into my yellows, and then finally at the very end, I'm going to go ahead and wet the entire center, and it's going to get really nice and really intense and vibrant. And while that dries, I'm going to quickly go ahead and sketch in a bud. And I felt that the composition was nicer with the bud on this side. So I'm just kind of copying what I'm seeing, but almost like reversing it. But you can go ahead and just copy me, because trying to draw something in reverse can be quite a challenge. Then once I do that, I'm going to take artistic license on the leaves as well. I didn't care for the way the leaves were in this particular image, and so I am going to take artistic license. These leaves probably won't look like perfect primrose leaves, but you know what? I think I'm going to be happy with it. So if you want to copy me, if you decide you like my end result, you can do that. Or you could go grab some other reference photos of primrose leaves and draw the leaves that you prefer for this flower. Then we'll let our flower dry completely before we add the next step. All right, so everything's dry and I'm coming in here with this beautiful pink color. And I will admit this flower isn't going to end up being a perfect match with my reference photo, but I really like this vibrant pink by Stidler. And so that is the color I'm going to be using to fill in my flower. I'm just filling this in with the pink color and paying attention. You'll notice in a few spots where there's almost like more light and it's a very, I don't know if you want to say soft, pinky purple color almost, or lighter pink. I'm going to leave those areas with a little bit less coloring. And then everything else, I'm just going ahead and just drawing my lines. Again, the coloring is almost like it's radiating out from the center of our flower. You could just color this in solid, but I think by doing it with a little bit of a directional coloring, if you will, it's going to help me start getting the effects of the creases and the folds that I'm seeing in the flower. And to really accentuate that, I'm going to put a little bit heavier pressure for some of these creases and folds, and then I'm going to actually start adding some shadows. So I'm looking at the reference photo and then seeing where that pink kind of gets really nice and dark. And for now, and even though I'll be adding some other colors, I'm just starting out by going really heavy where I see those shadows. So I'm just coloring the shadows in, looking at each petal that I see in the photo and trying to more or less copy those shadows. I'm not being 100% precise, and you don't have to be. Even if you just kind of get close, you're going to be amazed at the results you get. And even though this does kind of seem to slow down the coloring process, it's actually quite relaxing. We already have that basic drawing down, whether you drew this or traced it. And so you're really just looking at each single petal as you color it and really paying attention. Where does it get a little bit lighter? Where does it get a little bit darker? And you're just using that same pencil and you're just changing up the pressure that you're using. And when I come up to my yellow, I'm not really doing anything too special here. If you want to kind of give it that little jagged edge, you can, but in a lot of places, I'm not paying too much attention to that. I often do take artistic license and darken the petal that's behind, just where those two petals where the edges are meeting. I'll often darken that one that's back behind, right? But often, if you look at a reference photo, you'll see that's already happening for you. And if it's not, you can always just pay attention to that and consider adding it in. But then with this flower, we have some really unusual shadows, and this is something that you wouldn't necessarily know where to place such shadows. If you were just trying to draw something from your head, you'd be like, you don't get these really interesting shadows that you can see happening in this photo. And so that's one reason I chose this photo. I really, really liked the shadows and the light on it. I should say I really liked the way the light and shadows were kind of interacting on the primrose flower. And so that's something to keep in mind when you are choosing reference photos. Pay attention to what the light and the shadows are doing. It can make for a really interesting photo if you find something with some dramatic shadows. So I'm just kind of repeating myself as I go around these petals. I'm just doing that initial laydown of color, again, with my pencil strokes kind of all almost like, again, radiating out from the center of the flower, and then looking at my reference photo to figure out where do I need to go darker and where do I need to go lighter. You can already see just by doing this, this flower is really shaping up, even though we're still in our very first layer of color here. Again, we're separating things with this nice beautiful shadow here, which the reference photo already has. And we could go ahead and just start wetting it at this stage, or if we want, you could pick up a little bit. I've got like a mauve colored pencil. It's just a slight bit of a purpley pink, and I'm going to throw it in those areas that are lighter. Because I'm seeing a slight bit of purple in the light areas, or I could say like a mauvey color, I'm going to throw that in just really quickly. So looking at my reference photo and seeing where I'm seeing that really nice light purple color. This is totally optional though, because the flower would still look stunning without it. For the most part, I'm really just putting that purpley color at the very ends of each petal, or I should say the outside edges of the petal. And I'm really just kind of almost like scribble coloring. I'm not doing anything special. All right, now for our water, and I'm starting by blending in the lightest area first, just like we always do. And then I'm going to work my way to the outside edges of the petal where I have more of that purpley color. And then I'm washing that purple color off my brush and coming back in, or I should say coming downwards to blend in my shadow color. And I'm making my brush strokes kind of flow in the way, again, of the way the creases and the folds would be of the petals. So almost, again, radiating out from the center. I kind of drag that pink a little bit too close to the center of my flower, I think there. So pay attention that you don't do that. Then I'm going to skip around and go to a petal that's completely separated from that one so that I don't end up mushing the petals together. So I'll do the same thing, work in my lightest area and into my darks. Again, you'll notice the direction I'm stroking my brush. You can see sometimes I pull a little bit of that darker color out into the lighter sections. Washing and drying my brush so that I can come up here where there's like kind of a little bit of a light area right before that dark shadow. And I feel like it needs maybe just a little bit more color. So I'm taking the pigment right off my pink pencil with the tip of my brush. And I'm just going to drop a little bit more of that pinky color in there. I just want to intensify the color. I just felt it was like maybe just a little bit too washed out. And you will see in the end, my flower is not quite as intense as the reference photo, and that's okay. I really like the watercolor look that I'm still, particularly in that particular petal, still achieving. So just go ahead and drag that color down once again, working from lights to darks. And sometimes I am washing my brush because I am being aware of how I'm dragging that purple around because I have that tiny bit of purple in there, right? And once again, I want to intensify it by dropping just a little bit more of my pink in there. Let's even try for a little bit more of the purple, because it's going to dry lighter than it looks right now. Okay, can I do this shadow? Yeah, I'll try and work on it. Just right on this, where the shadow lands on this particular petal. And then I'll skip over to this petal so that I'm not touching the petals again. Because as you know, if I do two petals that are side by side and I'm not careful, those petals can just kind of end up blending into each other. So you can see there's a little gap there. Technically what I'm doing here is just half the petal this time, right? Because it is a full heart-shaped petal, but I'm just doing the half that's further away. Once again, drop some of that purple in there. And then I think it's dry enough, I can come to this petal. So again, working from light to dark. And then I'll come over here, do the same thing. I work in my light sections and then work my way into the dark sections. And you can see I'm sometimes messing up as I kind of come towards the center of the flower, but it'll be okay. I will end up fixing things up as I go. Everything's so wet, I'm gonna come and work on the little bud, and then I'll come back to the flower after. So I'm just, again, using that same pink and changing my pressure. So I want more dark pink at the center, or I should say at the base of each of these petals. And then I'm gonna come in with my brush and just blend from light to dark. And then I'm gonna let it dry before I do those little petals in the back, because once again, you know what will happen if I do them right? It will just all blend together. So I'm gonna go ahead and dry everything and then I'll be back. All right, so things are dry, so I can come in and do this next petal, and I'm starting again where it's light and working my way gradually into the darks. And it does actually take a little bit more effort to blend your pencil when you're using Arches watercolor paper, or I should say Arches cold press, because that paper does have some texture. So you might notice I'm taking a little more time with the blending than I would when I'm working on the cheaper paper, just because it does take that smidgen more effort. And that's another reason I really like the firm brushes for working in watercolor pencil. As you know, I do like the Simply Simons brush. They are a firmer brush, but I find they're really nice for encouraging that watercolor pencil to move around and blend a little bit better than a softer brush would. So just keep that in mind when you are working with watercolor pencils. A firmer brush can be really helpful. you will notice that that little area that's a bit lighter than the other areas, I've kind of filled it in, trying to lift it a bit, but because I will be making darker shadows, we'll be able to make this little light area pop a little bit more later. So I'm just going to go ahead and blend this final petal. And then let's just quickly go ahead and do these little petals in the back of the bud. I was thinking I would just do the one larger one, but I decided to just go ahead and do them both because I can always separate them further when I do another layer of color. So I'm just going to leave it like that for now. So I'm going to go ahead and let everything dry once again. And then once it's dry, we can add our shadow layer. I'm really looking forward to that part. So first of all, I've got my mauve color. This is kind of a purpley pink, and I'm going to start sketching in my shadows first with it. And once again, I'm looking at my reference photo to kind of see where my shadows should be placed. And as I said before, I'm not being super precise. I'm just trying to get some average placements here. You'll be surprised, without even being 100% accurate, how much more realistic this is going to look. But you can definitely tell with the way that I kind of stop with the coloring. It's because every time I stop, I'm taking a look at my reference photo, and then I get back into coloring, and then I kind of glance at my photo, start coloring. And so that's a very normal part of the process. And you'll probably discover once you start working from a photo, that's how you're going to be working too. Once I've got that mauve on, I'm coming in and throwing a little bit of purple. Actually, I think this particular pencil is called Violet, but it's really just a nice deep medium purple. And I'll throw that on the shadows just to push them that little touch further. I feel like I need another purple here, so I've picked up my Red Violet by Faber-Castell, and I'm adding that. It's kind of a nice, almost in between. It's not as light as the mauve color is, and yet it's definitely not as blue as that violet color. It's just a really nice, I would say, perfect color for the shadows for this flower. I'll still be throwing some of the purple in there, or I should say the violet in there too, but I'm going to be going a little bit back and forth, and I'm going to kind of almost do this a little bit more piecemeal. You could just go ahead and do all of the mauve, and then all of the red violet, and then all of the purple, or whatever colors you decide work well for your shadows, depending on what brand of color pencil you're working with. But you can see here, I'm kind of moving from one pencil to the other. So I'll pick up the mauve, then I'll pick up the red violet, and then I'll pick up the purple. And I'm almost doing one petal at a time, or even half a petal at a time. But as I said, there's no reason you can't go over the whole flower with one color, then over it again with the second color, and then finally the third color. There really isn't a right or a wrong way of doing that. And I want to make sure that I am happy with my shadows. So before I even finish doing the whole flower, I'm going to go ahead and start blending and just see how it's coming together. So I'm coming into the shadow areas. I'm not even wetting all of my lights right away. I'm just starting to blend that shadow around. And then to have it blend into my light color, I'm going to have to wash and dry my brush. And then I can kind of come into the clear areas, or I should say the lighter pink areas, right, that I haven't colored again, and just kind of blend that shadow out just until I'm happy with it. And once again, you can kind of do the same technique of grabbing some pigment right off your pencil and dropping it in with your brush. I'm going to go ahead and do this shadow here. And just like I did before, I didn't wet the whole petal. I'm just wetting the shadow first, blending it around. And I'm even looking at the reference photo, of course, as I'm doing it. And that's why my brush seems to kind of take a lot of little pauses. It's because I am looking at the reference photo and trying to watch where those shadows are. Then I wash and dry my brush and just kind of blend or soften the edges of the shadows with just a nice, slightly wet brush. So blend that little shadow and then come into the clear areas and just kind of moisten things around. And in this case, you can see I've kind of gone right for my lighter areas, and I'm just coming in here and blending the dark. So there really isn't a right or wrong way. You could go ahead and wet your lights like we always do, or if you want to wet your darks first, you just need to make sure that you've completely washed your brush and that it's clean before you come into your lighter areas. So it sounds a little bit reversed from how I usually work, but I'm still following the rule of making sure that I have a nice clean brush when I come into my light sections, and that I don't drag my darks into my lights without any control, right? If I kind of pull some of that dark in there, I'm doing it in a very controlled way. So since I'm happy with how the shadows are coming, I'm going to come back and work with my dry pencils once again up here. And as you can see, I'm not being especially precise with which order I'm laying these colors down in right now. I know they're going to work together, they're going to blend together, and the main thing that you want to keep in mind if you do decide to like use that darker color, like the violet color first, it is a color that leans towards the blue the most, and so it's going to have a dramatic effect on your shadow. And so when you apply it, just keep in your mind it's the color you don't want to overdo. That red violet is really the one that I think is the best color for these shadows, but I am still working with all three colors as you see me doing here. And you'll notice that when I apply my shadow color, I'm very much thinking about the direction of the creases and folds in these petals now. And so they are most definitely kind of running almost like, again, radiating from the center. That's typically the way all those little creases and folds will be, right, on a flower. And so the pencil strokes are definitely following that same direction. Shadows get really fun over here. They get so nice and deep and dark. It just really makes this flower pop. So I'll just go around the flower with these pencils and just kind of look for any areas that I feel like I need to, maybe either push my shadows a little bit darker, or maybe an area that I feel like I kind of missed. And then after that, I'll just jump into this little bud and follow the same principle of having things kind of go from light to dark. The darkest sections will be closest to kind of like the base or the center of the little bud, if you will, and then it kind of gets lighter as it comes to the top of each of these petals. All right, I'm going ahead and wetting that shadow shape again. And as you see, I came into my darks, but then I had to wash and dry my brush before I touch my lights. Once again, you see me doing that with these shadows. I'm coming into the shadows first, and you do see I'm getting a rather hard edge forming here, and that's okay. I'm going to be taking care of that in a minute. So I guess that's a case of knowing the rule and knowing how to break it. And if you're going to break the rule of working from light to dark, you just know you need to have a clean brush so that you're not dragging your darks into your lights too much. Once again, I'll be jumping around because I don't want to have all my petals blend together. I need to make sure I leave one petal dry and then come back to it later. And in this case, I am starting in the lighter sections and I'll work my way into my darks. So I don't always have a strong rhyme or reason for how and when I do that. Sometimes it just feels more comfortable to kind of go in and start blending that shadow, but there's other times it just feels like, you know what, it feels good to just start with those lights and work my way into the shadows. Okay, I'm being very careful over here because I'm blending this in and things are damp on both sides, which is fine. I don't mind it blending. As you know, this is still part of one larger petal. There's two sides of it, so I don't mind if they blend together a bit. I just don't want it to blend into the petal behind it. Here I'm starting in my lights and working into the darks, and then you can see wanting to throw a little bit more of that pigment in there. I'll leave that shadow till after. So once again, in my lights, throwing a little more color in there to kind of make it a little more vibrant, which I don't know. I do like the watercolor look that I have there, so I don't know. I might get it too dense with color, but we'll see. And then I work my way into the dark. So you can see I'm being a little bit more traditional in my approach here. And then into my shadow here, very cautiously. I'm using a clean brush to kind of just guide it. I don't want to have it go overboard over there. And then we'll just blend this shadow here. Then I'm noticing there's a little bit of dark there that I missed, so I'm just coming in there and throwing that in really quickly. It was dry, so I could do that. And then I'm going to come in and just blend things around a little bit on my bud. Again, working from light to dark. So again, usually If in doubt, work from light to dark. And if you feel like you can grab that dark and blend it first, just remember to always wash that brush. All right, so everything is fully dry, and I'm gonna come in and work on the center of this flower quickly here. So I have a nice light green, and I'm gonna be tracing almost, if you will, the areas where I have drawn the flower center before, but it's almost disappeared, isn't it? So I have to look at the reference photo to kind of guide me, and you can definitely see me working tentatively. Once again, this is the way I work when I do work from a photo, and I'm trying to get a little bit more of a realistic look in my work. It's quite a bit different than when I'm doing a simple basic flower from my head, isn't it? For those of you who have watched me do my flowers before, you can definitely see the difference here in the way I'm working. And this is a much more right-brained process, this kind of copying. And it's a really helpful way to work on something if you've never drawn it before, or if it's something you're not as familiar with, or if you're just wanting your little painting to look more realistic. Using a reference photo and just copying the shapes is such an amazing way to learn. I have to confess, primroses aren't a flower I'm quite as familiar with. I did practice and study them a little bit beforehand. And you know what was kind of neat? The other day when I was out grocery shopping, I walked into a grocery store where I don't usually shop, but they have a florist there. And what would you know, when I came in the door, they had some little pots of primrose flowers right there. You know, sometimes the Lord just provides us little things in our daily life that, you know, they're so small, and yet it's just so neat because I was already starting to plan out my primroses, sketch some primroses, and I just thought it was so fun to be able to see some little primroses in real life, particularly because I'm not that familiar with them. But since I don't have a photographic memory, that is why I'm working from a photo for this project. And then you can see here, I've picked up my darker green just to kind of push these colors a little bit deeper and darker. Then once I'm more or less happy with that, I'm going to come in and blend everything. So I'm working from light to dark this time. And you can see sometimes I'm dragging a little bit of that pink in, which I'm okay with because this is kind of an interesting dull colored center here. Then I'm actually grabbing my pink watercolor pencil and just dropping a little bit of that pink into this area because I feel like there's some areas the green is rather dull. And the pink is going to help to neutralize those colors and give it just a slightly more of a dull green. And then I'm using a damp brush to just kind of very gently kind of soften the edges, kind of where the yellow and the pink of the whole flower meet. Just the transition there that I have, I'm not super crazy about, so I'm just gently kind of softening that with my brush. And I don't want to go into the very center of the flower yet because everything, as you know, will blend around. So I'm going to come and work on the leaves quickly and just fill them in with a light green. So I'm not doing anything special here with the coloring, basically just filling those leaves up with this nice kind of light lime green color. Then I'm picking up my darker green once again, and I'm just going to kind of come to the base of each of these little leaves and deepen them with the dark green. And I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of the shadow as well to the base of this little bud. And I'm thinking about putting my shadow more on the left, lower side of each of these shapes. So on the base, it's a lower left, and then on the leaves, I'm going to try and think lower left as well. I'm imagining the light is coming from our upper right, because that's the way it seems to be in the reference photo. I'm also going to add a little bit of shading to each of these little veins here, and I'm not being super precise with my placement. So what I do is I draw my center vein first, and then I draw these side veins coming off from it. And as you can see, even when I divide the leaf in half with that vein, I am putting the shadow kind of like it's on the lower left side of, say, the whole top half, if that makes sense. But I'll be repeating that concept on the bottom half, if you want to call it the bottom half, of this leaf as well. So the shadow is going to be more on the bottom, a little bit more to the left side of the leaf. So I'm just going to repeat that on all my leaves. But first, why don't I go ahead and do a cast shadow where the primrose flower itself is kind of casting a shadow over the leaves, so you can kind of see a bit of a shadow right along here. So I'm going to do that to all of the leaves first. Then I'll come back in and draw my veins, and then just add a little bit of shading to them and some more shadow to the rest of my leaf as well. You can just copy what I'm doing or use a reference photo if you're wanting some primrose leaves that are a little more accurate than mine. Like I say, taking a little artistic license, but overall, I think I'm happy with this. So I'm just gonna leave it like that. You know what? I'm gonna make these leaves just a tiny bit longer looking. I'm not gonna do anything major here, but because primroses do kind of have a longer leaf, don't they? So maybe I can sort of make these look a little bit longer. There's not much I'm gonna do here. All right, now for our blending, I'm gonna actually come in and start with the center of our flower because we never did blend that yet, right? So I'm gonna quickly go ahead and just very, very carefully blend those colors in. My brush is fairly dry for this part. And I'm just gonna use a damp brush and just very gently, once again, kind of, I don't know, just soften the edges of the yellows. In some places, I feel like that transition between the pink and the yellow is a little bit, I don't know, harsh. So I'm just softening it with a wet, clean brush. All right, now I'm going to do each of these little sections. So I don't want to be too wet here. I'm working kind of dry and I'm going to be blending with a slightly, I don't know if you want to say bouncy motion, but I don't want to be taking long brush strokes. I just want to be doing a lot of short, little tiny strokes and almost dotting so that I don't get that color really blending out too much on me here. You know what? I think I'm going to throw a little bit of indigo, this dark indigo color on my veins, just so that it makes them just a smidge bit darker. And this dark indigo is by Faber-Castell. Throw a little bit on the left side of the bud. And then just quickly go over all the veins. Maybe a little bit in that deeper part of the shadow that's on the lower sections of our leaves. Again, I'm thinking lower left. Okay, let's get back to our blending. So let's start with the lightest section and then pull my way into the dark. And you know what? For these tiny little leaves, while that leaf is dark, I'm gonna grab my pink watercolor pencil that we've been using all along, and I'm just gonna dot or drip a tiny little bit of that pink color at the very, very tips of each of these, and just kind of let it move around on its own. So this is gonna keep us from getting mud, hopefully, by just getting it in there, dropping it in there, and trying not to overwork it. I do want it to have a nice little tip. I'm lifting a little more than I'd like to here, but okay, leave that alone. And back into the greens. So like I say, I'm working kind of on the dry side and working very carefully so that I more or less maintain my lights versus my darks. And for my leaves, I am going to be really more or less just going from light to dark, and working my way around the leaves that way. There isn't really much need to kind of go into those shadows first. At least I don't feel like there is. I feel like it works best for the most part to always start with my lights and work into my darks. And so since this is pretty self-explanatory, I'm going to be repeating the same thing again and again. I will speed the video up since I don't really think there's going to be any new concepts. And so you can see this project is a little bit of a blend of working from our imagination as well as working from a photo, isn't it? And yet I feel like the results have worked out fairly well. But I'd like to know your thoughts on this project because like I say, this project is more of an intermediate project compared to the rest of the watercolor pencil flowers I've done on this channel. But for those of you who have been following along with the beginner watercolor pencils, I'd like to know, was this something that felt achievable for you? Have you worked from a reference photo before? And would you like to see more projects like this one? Just let me know in the comments below. One thing I really like about Arch's watercolor paper is I feel like it's really grabbing onto that pigment and locking it in nicely. And my colors feel nice, deep, and intense. And so I'm not going to be adding another layer to these leaves. I'm just going to leave them as they are. And as you know, sometimes I do like dropping a little bit of pink into my leaves, but today I'm just going to keep it simple and just go ahead and blend these the way they are, just to keep things nice and simple. And I think they really are working quite beautifully. All right, now I'm taking a little bit of a risk here, but I want to push the center of my flower a little bit more. So you guys can just watch if you want, and if you like the effect, you can go ahead and do it on yours. But I feel like there's even a tiny bit of a little bit of a red undertone to some of these little creases in the very center. So I'm going ahead with my pink and I'm just putting those little lines there with my pink color. And I'll even put a little bit of it on top of my green. Might even push my dark green a little bit more here as well. I'm being pretty cautious, and once again, I'm looking at the photo just to see where I feel like things are a little bit darker and a little bit more shaded. And these are just extra little details. You can see it's not doing anything dramatic, but it does add a tiny extra touch. I'm also going to go ahead and pick up my red violet and just go over the whole flower, just pushing a few of those shadows a little bit further. So basically anywhere that I feel the shadows could just be a tiny little bit darker, I'm just quickly going in, kind of scribbling that in with my red violet. And of course, this is completely dry when I'm doing this. And once again, I'm just speeding up the video because I have a lot of this stop and start motion happening. All right, so I'm working with a fairly dry brush now to just blend the center of this flower. I really don't want to get it too wet. My overall goal is just to add enough water just to blend things so that I don't have the colored pencil look so much as a watercolor look. But it is looking almost too vibrant a green, isn't it? So a quick fix for that is I'll just dab it quickly with my paper towel, and that just kind of lightened it off a little bit, didn't it? And then I'm coming in with a pretty damp brush. I don't want it to be too wet, and I'm just very, very carefully moistening those shadows where I just went over that with that red violet pencil. So I'm just going in really quickly, but I'm not really making them blend into the rest of the petal, if that makes sense. These are going to have hard edges, or they're going to just be a little bit more stark, but I really like how it's looking. It's just making those shadows just pop that tiny little bit more. I'll be breaking down the process of working from a photo even more step by step in the watercolor pencil course that I'm putting together. And I'd love to know if that's something that would be of interest to you, because I believe that once you have confidence working from a photo, it's going to equip you to do so much more with your art. If that sounds like something you want to know more about, you'll want to be sure to be on my email list so that you'll be the first to know when my course is ready. If you've enjoyed working in watercolor pencils, you'll want to check out my watercolor pencil playlist where I have a lot of beginner-friendly projects. And hopefully in the near future, I'll get more intermediate projects out as well. In the meantime, I hope this tutorial has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye!